Welcome to the Worcester Senior Center. My name is Suki Lapin. I'm the program coordinator here, and I am thrilled to welcome Judith Ferrara. Today, we're talking about Yetta Dine and Stanley Kunitz. Who were they? Portrayed in her son Stanley Kunitz's poems and interviews as an unforgiving and unaffectionate mother, Yetta Dine's recently recovered letters, memoir, and diary reveal a more complicated story. Learn about this fascinating woman who lived on Green, Providence, and Woodford Streets, right in this neighborhood, and managed a children's dress-making factory at 65 Water Street, when Judith Ferrara talks about her new book, Feasts of Loss, Yetta Dine and her son, the poet Stanley Kunitz. Welcome, author Judith Ferrara.
Thank you, Suki, and thank you, Worcester Senior Center. Can you hear me? Okay, very good. The Worcester County Poetry Association and the Telegram for spreading the word about today, and special thanks to you, everyone who's sitting there waiting to hear Yetta's story. And of course, if you hear Yetta's story, you're going to hear Stanley's story. What I'm going to do is talk for about 30 minutes-ish, and John, raise your hand. He's going to give me the signal that you're talking too long. You better just wrap it up. And then if you have things you want to talk about, something that we said today that we talked about, and you want to know a little more, if I know it, we can talk about it, and we can really get into maybe some personal stories. Here we are on Vernon Hill. Did anybody here grow up on Vernon Hill? Raise your hand. Oh. Anybody go to school on Vernon Hill? Yep. That's right, St. Vincent's, and they've just torn that down. Right. So, who was here on March 14th, 2001, to hear Stanley Kunitz read in front of that quilt? You were here. So were we. John, Carol, yeah. That was a memorable day. 2001, 96-year-old Stanley Kunitz, renowned poet, activist, teacher, essayist. He came to Worcester again to visit his friends the poets, but also his friends Carol and Greg Stockholm. Carol, raise your hand. Oh, Carol, and Jude knows her too. Carol and Greg, for 20 years, had a friendship with Stanley Kunitz. And Carol has brochures to share with you, because her home and Stanley Kunitz's boyhood home are designated a literary landmark by the American Library Association. So the story of that is on the brochure, and so I hope that you have a chance to get one of the brochures from Carol, because she's got those for you. Stanley Kunitz won every poetry honor there was. He won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry. He was a poetry consultant to the Library of Congress. And then, when they changed that to Poet Laureate of the United States, he had both of those honors. And there are fewer than 10 poets who have been twice honored. He was born at 133 Green Street. He is Worcester's pride. I'd like to just say a few words about a sense of place. We all walk or drive by buildings, homes. Do we wonder about the people who lived there before us? Do we remember families who lived or worked there? Today, we are going to spend some time with the Kunitz-Dine family, who lived at 133 Green Street, which is now the parking lot of the restaurant across from Bedlam Books, corner of Ash Street, 79 Green Street, 54 and 58 and 146 Providence Street, and finally 4 Woodford Street. And this is a story about the mother of that family who immigrated from Lithuania in 1890 and landed on New York's Lower East Side, where she worked for 3 years in the garment industry. And then she moved here to Worcester in 1893 to be married and lived here until 1934. At the end, she lived on and off here because she lived with her daughter also. Before this book, what we know about Jetta Kunitz-Dine is what her son, Stanley, portrayed of her in his poems and in interviews, and in a highly edited 9-page chapter in this book, which is out of print, next to Last Things, and he calls it My Mother's Story. And in that 9-page, highly edited excerpt, he took her memoir and took it down to a very highly polished piece of writing. I transcribed the original, as Suki said, her newly recovered letters, her memoir, and her diary. Actually, this is a copy each page of everything in the documents. This is the photocopy, and this is the transcription of every word, every letter, spelling uncorrected. And Jetta was a terrible speller, but. So what we know about Jetta is really what her son Stanley portrayed of her, and he made a very specific portrait. This is not a good son, good mother, bad mother story. What this is a fuller, more meaningful corrective to who Jetta Dine was. This is how most people meet Jetta. This is Judy trying technology. This is a poem that Stanley read right in this room in 2001.
And here's one of the poems that Galway alluded to, The Portrait. My mother never forgave my father for killing himself, especially at such an awkward time and in a public park that spring when I was waiting to be born. She locked his name in her deepest cabinet and would not let him out, though I could hear him thumping. When I came down from the attic with the pastel portrait in my hands of a long-lipped stranger with a brave mustache and deep brown level eyes, she ripped it into shreds without a single word and slapped struck me hard. In my 64th year, I can feel my cheek still burning.
If you think about that poem, and if it would be your first impression of Yetta, you would have a certain feeling toward her. You might ask yourself, why did she do that? Why did she slap him? In 1969, Stanley started to write this poem, and his early drafts are at Princeton University where his papers are, 115 linear feet of them. And this early draft of the portrait is a little bit different from his final draft. And that's what poets do. We all know that. When I came down from the attic with the pastel portrait in my hand of the long-lipped stranger with a brave mustache and deep brown level eyes, she ripped it into shreds without a single word and slapped me hard, inconsolably sobbing. In my 64th year, I can feel my cheek still burning. Did something happen to your feelings when you heard the early draft? Did your feelings toward her change from the first time you heard him read it? Well, he did what poets do. He needed to refocus that poem, and it's about him and how this boy felt when this happened. And if he used that phrase, inconsolably sobbing, I think your feelings would shift toward her. And he did not need that as a poet. So that was, of course, that's my theory, because I write poetry and I make all kinds of decisions. But let's meet Yetta. One of the great ways, and I hope some of you still do it, to really get to know somebody is to have them write a letter. Well, there were 4 letters that were recovered. And one thing about a letter, I think we get our true voices, and we do it now in emails for sure. But letters, of course, are for the ages if somebody preserves them, which is kind of nice. We're going to meet Yetta. She's 78 years old. She's living with a great niece in Tarrytown, New York. And she has lost 6 of her 7 children. Stanley, who is in the Army in Washington, D.C., his wife has just joined him, is her only surviving son. And one of the things I learned and noted as I was doing the transcription of the letters and the diary and the memoir was that she capitalized those words, my only surviving son. Dear Stanley and Eleanor, I got home Tuesday in time to listen to Eleanor's radio talk, and I enjoyed it very much. I had to see the dentist Tuesday morning. The same day, or rather in the evening, I got a telegram that my brother Abe passed away. The news was not unexpected. I knew that he was very ill, yet it knocked me out, and I was terribly upset that I could not go to the funeral. He died here in Worcester. She was in New York, in Tarrytown. And so his troubles are ended. At that same hour, I received a telegram from Michigan City, Indiana, that a baby boy was born, a grandchild to my great-nephew. One life gone, another arrived. Stanley, when you asked me to write some of my memories, I did not know if you really meant it. I thought about it and wondered who would be interested enough to waste the time and read it, unless you could take out some of it like the chemist does, with all the tons of material and used to extract an ounce of something worthwhile. So I decided to try. I'm all alone because Rosalind went to Boston. I scribbled a few pages as a very poorly made sample, but I want to know if you think you could do something with it. I know you can add the collar and trimming. I could elaborate on every subject for pages and pages. It is not fiction, it is all facts. If you think it is worthwhile, let me know, and if you want me to really do it, I'll try to improve my writing and spelling. She didn't. I hope you will be able to read it and understand the subjects. You could add on a lot by using imagination and history, especially about the Polish Revolution. I really enjoy writing it and living over my childhood, although it was not a very pleasant one. Hoping you are both well and not working too hard. With love, Mother. Now, why is that letter so important? Well, it was the first one I read, so it's important to me personally. But I noticed some things in that letter that did not match what Stanley Kunitz had said about his mother in interviews, especially, and in poems too. In interviews, he said that he convinced his mother to write her memoir in 1951 when she was in a rest home in Mount Vernon, New York, after she had suffered a stroke, and she was really fed up with the wasteful indolence of her days. And so he said, right. Now that's a nice story, but it's not true because this letter was written in 1945. So that was the first letter, and it made me sit up and say, well, what else? What else is not true? She uses these wonderful phrases. A poorly made sample. You could add the collar and trimming. Did you hear that? That's from her days in the garment district of Lower Manhattan, working in factories. She never worked in a sweatshop, which is another story Stanley told, which really fit in with the immigrant story. But she never worked in a sweatshop. She worked in factories, and there was a difference. Also, the Polish Revolution. She is speaking about the Polish-Lithuanian insurrection of 1863-1864. And that happened just before she was born. So the Tsar's retaliation, especially against the Lithuanians, was the world she grew up in. And it was the period of compulsory Russification. So that's your introduction to Jetta. Now I'd like to let you hear a little bit about Lithuania. Jetta Jaspin was born in a shtetl, or market town, near the provincial capital of Kovno, Lithuania, during the period known as compulsory Russification. In short, Tsar Alexander II issued a shroud of extinction for Lithuanian nationality, language, culture, and history. Jetta's memoir provides details of Jewish life, record-keeping, conscription, and bribery. She was a keen observer whose memories showcase her keen, sharp-witted, and skeptical mind. So, without my consent, I was brought into the world much too early in the year 1866. And if I had my choice, it was also in the wrong place. Yashwin, a God-forsaken town in the province of Kovno, Lithuania. The population of about 300 families consisted of Poles, Jews, Germans, and Lithuanians. The latter were the majority, about 150 families. Jewish, about 100, Poles, 40, and so on, and a few Germans. The Lithuanian Poles had small farms, and their entire families worked in the fields in the summer. In winter, women would spin yarn of wool and flax and weave cloth to make into garments for the family. The men worked in the forest cutting lumber. Their pay was about 1.5 rubles per 6-day week. The hours depended on the daylight. Jewish men were traders, merchants, and saloon keepers, with a few artisans, such as tailors and shoemakers. There was one coppersmith. The Germans made earthenware pottery, such as you see now on 57th Street in the antique shops. German cabinet makers and woodworkers made everything: spinning wheels, barrels, tubs, pails, boards, rolling pins, spoons, and numerous other articles. There was also a blacksmith and a locksmith. Everything made was sold to the local community, and the surrounding village people who came to the Catholic Church, which brought in most of the business into town. Perhaps 50 surrounding villages had come to this Catholic Church, the only one in the district. And I've read this section is because this is one of the things that the Tsar did, is he closed the Catholic churches, except for a few, and people had to travel into the market towns. So this is one of the towns, this is the town that she grew up in, and that was their function. So that was one of the effects of Russification. So that's why I read that. And there's another section of that. An incident. Since I ever could remember, Father was always in poor health because of an incident that happened before I was born, about 2 years before she was born. One of his businesses was to supply food and grain for the Russian army horses. When the Polish-Lithuanian Revolution started, the Russians prosecuted those who supported Poland, and the Poles did the same to those who supported Russia. The Poles had Father on the list of Russian supporters. He knew that that could mean death. He decided to go to Warsaw, where he knew 2 leaders of the rebels, Graf Radziwill and Graf Agnusi. He left Mother at home with 2 small children. It took weeks before he could get in touch with them, and finally, they promised him freedom if he would stop supplying the Russian army. They told him he could return home, and in case someone molested him, they gave him a letter signed by both that he was not to be troubled anymore. Father returned home late one evening, happy with what he had accomplished, and told Mother not to worry. The next morning, a group of rebels came and took Father out of bed. They told him not to bother dressing because they were going to hang him. They had the rope. They walked him through to the street to the river, which was not far. There was a tree where many innocent people were hanged by both Russians and Poles. Father, in his haste, forgot about the letter, but Mother ran after them, crying and waving the letter. She reached them just in time to save Father's life. How history repeats itself almost a century later. Europe suffers again, only in a crueler way and on a larger scale. Father was ruined financially and broken in health. It took months before he could do anything. No one was sure what would happen from day to day. I picked this also as a, John? No way. Really? Oh, gee. Keep talking. But thank you. But all right, I'll keep going. All right, yeah. Okay. That kind of rattled me just a little. You've seen me rattle. You'll probably see me rattle again. Okay. I think I'll go right to Worcester. Let me just say, though, she writes about her time in 1890 to 1893 on the Lower East Side. Unforgettable. If you think you have read an immigrant account of what it was like, hers is unbelievably expert. She knows, as this story about her father, she knows how to tell the story, and then she knows how to work in the lesson. So she's almost an expert fable writer. She uses the truth of a situation, and then she tells you, this is what we should think about. So that's why I adored her. From the time I started copying out word by word, I thought, oh, this woman needs a book. This is her voice. This is her voice. Okay, I'm going to go right to Worcester, because we're in Worcester and we're on Vernon Hill. I mean, really. In 1893, Worcester was a thriving industrial city surrounded by the upheaval of a severe economic depression. Not every business was successful, and not everyone welcomed to its newest citizens. George Maynard, born 1850, lived till 1917, was born into a farming family in nearby Paxton and came to Worcester in 1869 to seek a different life. He kept a diary from 1862 to 1909 and recorded his travails, adventures, and poetry, along with the weather and the local news. By the way, his papers are at the Worcester Historical Museum. Maynard's small printing business was barely solvent in 1893. During hard times, he walked to orchards and subsisted on meals of berries and fruits that had fallen to the ground. On July 30th, Maynard observed, "When I was a boy, matters were very different, and people went where they pleased and did as they pleased. But the great influx of the lawless foreign element into the city has hardened farmers' hearts, and they have declared war to the knife on all, quote, trespassers, whether roughs or philosophers under penalty of law." Welcome or not, immigrants continued to come. By 1895, the city was home to 100,000 people, and we're back up to that now, I guess, the last census. Nearly a third were foreign-born: Irish, French, Canadian, Poles, Ukrainians, English, Scots, Armenians, Finns, and Swedes, settled in pockets throughout the city. Churches and synagogues dotted the neighborhoods. Factories attracted workers like dry sponges absorbing water. Chimneys belched smoke. Tools, barbed wire, fencing were products that satisfied a national market and kept the open hearth blast furnaces active. Production of corsets and all manner of clothing filled the needs of customers near and far. In 1893, Worcester's East Side was home and workplace to the growing Jewish population, a group skilled in wholesaling and retailing cotton and woolen dry goods, and in tailoring and manufacturing clothing. The first job, this is a quote from Susan Ciccacci, who has written about the history of Worcester. The first job of many Jewish immigrant men was to travel around on foot, peddling cloth, lace, sewing notions, household goods, or collecting junk or old rags for resale. As they accumulated enough capital, many were able to buy a horse and wagon, and later to establish a store or business. And at 133 Green Street, where Stanley Kunitz was born in 1905, the first floor was a dry goods store, and Yetta worked there, and they lived on the third floor. I'm going to read a stanza from his poem, Halley's Comet. "Look for me, Father, on the roof of the red brick building at the foot of Green Street. That's where we live, you know, on the top floor." And that is on That stanza is on the Polar Park mural. So if you walk on, is it Gold Street where the mural is? I'm pretty sure it is. You're going to see, of the 5 people there, the portrait of Stanley, and this poem is floating over him. That stanza is floating over him. And that's a thrill. That is a thrill, because it's a block from where he was born. Back to, let's go to Solomon Kunitz, Yetta's husband, her first husband. Solomon Kunitz was born in 1865 and emigrated in 1887 from Odessa, Ukraine, which was then part of the Russian Empire. He settled in Providence, Rhode Island, where he worked at a gold paint factory. In 1893, he traveled 45 minutes north to Worcester and married Yetta Jaspin, a union possibly arranged by her brother Abe. Now, we've already met Abe in the first letter. He has just passed away. Abe was working as a cutter at a Worcester wrapper factory, and wrappers were women's coats and outer garments. 26-year-old Yetta would have been viewed as a good match. She had 3 years of experience in the New York garment trade and confidence that a business could prosper if she were only given the chance to try. She used that phrase, just give me the chance to try. On July 27, 1893, Yetta and Solomon married. Solomon Kunitz was destined for the front pages of Worcester papers twice. And by the way, there's a map in here of the neighborhood at that time. Solomon started a small women's clothing manufacturing shop at 83 Green Street. Soon he was able to expand and move into a factory on the corner of Winter and Harding Street. Bocado's Tapas Bar, their parking lot is Solomon, where the Solomon's factory was. By 1897, the Parisian wrapper manufacturing company was prospering, and Solomon was featured as one of 9 men and 1 woman in the business section of the Fitchburg Sentinel. He became a member of Brit Abraham and the Sons of Benjamin, Jewish men's fraternal orders, which adopted Masonic rituals. The couple could not know that skeins of loss would unravel, tumble into their path, and throw them profoundly off balance. On January 26, 1895, Yetta gave birth to Harris, who was named after her father. 8 months later, the boy died from a severe form of gastroenteritis. Sarah Agnes was born on January 25th, 1896. Bessie was born on July 20th, 1897, but died January 10th from spasm of glottis rickets. The Hebrew word shakul translates into parents who have lost children, and the Kunitzes absorbed the heartache of that appellation. On January 20th, 1899, the Worcester Spy's front page headline declared, "Big loss, Parisian wrapper company is badly gutted. An early morning blaze on Winter Street. During the night, a mysterious fire started in the basement cutting room of the 4-story brick building. Small pieces of cloth and bolts of fabric burned like powder. The fire spread upward quickly through a freight elevator shaft located in the corner of the building." And there's a description of the fire and the loss, but I'm going to pick up where a spy reporter went to 54 Providence Street, which is the White House on the corner. It has probably octagonal turret on the end, and woke Solomon Kunitz and his family. When told of the fire, he, quote, was greatly overcome. Kunitz told the reporter that his insurance policy, worth $50,000, covered the building, stock, and machinery. Anticipating the busiest season of the year, new fabrics had been purchased, making the loss greater than the coverage. 3 months earlier, he had taken on 2 partners from Boston and made improvements to the factory, including $2,000 in the office area. Kunitz stated, "I had the best factory for the manufacturer of wrappers in the country, with 225 machines of the latest design. At the present time, there have been about 300 girls employed here, with orders for between 50,000 and 60,000 ahead. The safe and till were intact, but the machinery was a total loss. The article stated that, quote, the large amount of extra fine stock, which he had on ready for shipment, made the loss seem almost irreparable. Some wrappers and dresses had been rescued and brought to Asa Goddard's stockroom in the neighboring building. What ignited the fire? No oil was stored in the basement, so the boiler was ruled out. The mystery remained unsolved. In the following months, Jetta became pregnant again, but delivered a stillborn male on October 12, 1899. So I'm looking at the clock and it is 20 of, and I'm just going to say that the next chapter, after we go with Jetta on the journey of losing her husband to suicide and losing her second husband to a heart attack, she's living between her 2 daughters, one, Sophia Eisenberg here in Worcester, and another in New York. So Sarah moved to New York. So she was living between both places at the end. But the next chapter is the diary, where she has a stroke. She's living in Tarrytown. And the diary is let me just read one. I'll describe it to you. Yet as health continued to decline, her stroke likely occurred in late February or early March, after which she was moved to the Westchester Convalescent Nursing Home. Stanton Baker's wife, Lucille, recalled that Rosalind and Nathan couldn't take care of her anymore. You look so interested. You are hard to stop reading to. I have to say, this is one of the most beautiful audiences. You're giving so much back to Jetta at this point. But I'll just read this one page and then we'll. She sat in her room with a pencil poised over a 25-cent spiral notebook. Like a dutiful student, she printed her name on the brown cardboard cover. Mrs. Y.H., Helen was her middle name, Dine. Now 84 years old, she was a shadow of the woman she was in 1945 when writing her memoir gave her renewed energy and purpose. On the other hand, the notebook fulfilled a need, a place to collect her thoughts, dark as they could be. She opened to a page near the middle, Wednesday, March 7th. This would be her habit. Open the notebook, find a blank page, and if she were interrupted or feeling ill or tired, fold back the metal spiral and resume mid-sentence another day. It was an undisciplined approach, but at least she was writing. Deterioration of her handwriting was a blow to the inveterate letter writer. Some days she struggled to stay on the lines, multiplied the arcade formation of her M's and N's, and added E's and M's to words such as seam, and in. She rarely crossed her T's. A combination of damage to her motor system, possible worsening vision, bouts of asthma, and encroaching deafness added to her woes. The notebook functioned as a diary, although at times it shifted into a letter to her son, a farewell speech to her family and friends, or an agonized plea to God for release from a life bereft of independence, usefulness, and connection. Even then, she clung to the idea that her writing would be published. Remember at the beginning, if you could make something of this, she wanted her writing published. She pulled at threads of happiness and mixed memories with hope and imagination. She even designed a plan to rebuild a life of self-sufficiency and purpose. She wanted to move closer to Manhattan and get a job. She heard about some jobs, and she wanted to take creative writing courses at the college. So sadly, I've got to stop. But the next chapter is after the diary chapter, Stanley Kunitz's relationship to his family, and why he referred to Worcester in the early days as the city that scarred him permanently. But he came back because of people who reached out to him through his poems, and he embraced the city like no other poet has ever done. No other poet. Elizabeth Bishop was born here, she's buried here, but she didn't come back and do what Stanley did. I mean, I'm not denigrating Elizabeth Bishop by any stretch of the imagination. She's a magnificent poet. But as far as what being available to the city of Worcester was all about, Stanley wrote the book on that. He loved this city because of the woman sitting here, Carol Stockmall, and that friendship that they embraced, 20-year friendship. If you know the poem, My Mother's Pears, and big sections of it are quoted in here, that is dedicated to Carol and Greg Stockmall. And we're so honored to have you here, Carol. No matter what fancy event Stanley had going on here, including coming to the Senior Center to read with all the television cameras that were here on that day. You remember that? NBC was here, or CBS. It was just one of those things. But it's been an honor and a pleasure to talk with you all, and your attention it shines right on every face. And any one of you who have ever done any speaking of any sort, you know the signs. Right. But none of that. It was just, you were with me every sentence, and you met Yetta, and you didn't meet a lot of Stanley in here, but he is interwoven in so much. And it's really a time for her turn at the table. She's sitting at the table. It's a fuller portrait. It's the difference between a Matisse line drawing of her and an Annie Leibovitz portrait. Think about those, the detail, the stories that are written in the wrinkles on her faces. Yes.
You're certainly well spoken, and I'm looking forward to reading what you've written. Have you written more, published more poetry or books?
Of my poem?
Yeah.
My poems? Yes. Yeah, I have 3 books of poetry, and one is a book of essays and artwork because I'm also an artist. Travel journals, artwork, and poetry about different places. So that book is a kind of a multi. And then 2 books of poetry, one of which is 2 of are out of print. But I'm planning on working into a selection of collecting my poems and doing that in the future. Right now it's about Yetta, and that is, thank goodness it's my focus. I feel that she's working with me in so many ways that I don't want to describe because they are amazing and sometimes very personal, but I feel as if it's been a journey of 14 years. That's how long this has been, where I started the research because of Carol and designing the docent program. I had to start researching Stanley Kunitz, and I really didn't focus on Yetta. And then teaching the class at WISE, 2 classes at WISE, Worcester Institute for Senior Education here in Worcester, the big draw, of course, was going to Carol's house for a house tour. But what happened was the students, the participants, they were up in arms because all we were reading was Stanley's version of his mother. She never kissed me. I can never remember being kissed when I was young. She was always too busy working. You know, it was always unaffectionate mother and secretive because she wouldn't speak. That was the thing. She would never speak about Solomon. That suicide was not to be spoken about. Oh, you know, they said, what's the matter with her? She slaps him, you know, she doesn't give him supper. He goes up on the roof and he's looking for his father. What's the matter with her? And so I thought, there's got to be more to this than that. And so that my mother's story, which is that 9-page excerpt, which is, by the way, since this is out of print, is completely reprinted in the back of this book. That's it. I thought there's got to be more. And so, and Princeton had some letters, but not a whole lot. But then I contacted his daughter in California. She's a doctor. And she had come to Worcester for the literary landmark. This is the story. Dedication. And so I had a correspondence because I wrote some essays that were published about Stanley Kunitz and the house and the neighborhood and everything. Anyway, so I said, you know, do you have that original memoir? And she said, yes, it's in my attic. So do you want me to send it to you? And I said, sure. So my intention, never to write a book, never. It was to transcribe, as I did, I showed you those big volumes, transcribe every letter of every word that she said, all the documents that were in there, the 4 letters, and it'll be in an archive, hopefully Princeton, soon, because we don't know, you know, when that's going to happen exactly. But that was the thing, is that my intention as a researcher was just to focus on future researchers and future biographers of Stanley Kunitz and all that's going to happen to him. But then I read the first pages and I thought, this is so different from this little excerpt, this stereotypical strong, lone immigrant comes over from Lithuania all by herself. No, she was so tied into family because he shunned that. He made, in his version of her, he also made her be like that. She was a solitary, heroic. She was heroic, but that was her. She was that presence. But she was much more textured than that. I mean, her writing is just, as you heard little bits of, we do have to stop people.
You're an inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, okay.
Do you want to read just one poem and then
One poem.
one or one that you
One.
like to choose?
That's an idea.
And then we
Yep.
can be on our way or
Okay.
eat lunch. How's that? All right?
Where's
Or a few poems. We do have a little time, so
a complete
you.
copy of my mother's pears? Oh, Carol, you're a genius. Wait a minute, let me turn this on. Hope I have the right one. Let's try.
My mother's pears. Plump, green gold, Worcester's pride, transported through autumn skies, in a box marked handle with care, sleep 18 barklet pears, hand-picked and polished and packed for deposit at my door, each in its crinkled nest, with a stub of stem attached and a single bright leaf like a flag. A smaller than usual crop, but still enough to share with me, as always at harvest time. Those strangers are my friends, whose kindness blesses the house my mother built at the edge of town, beyond the last trolley stop, when the century was young, and she proposed for her children's sake to marry again, not knowing how soon the windows would grow dark and the velvet drapes come down. Rubble accumulates in the yard. Workmen are hammering on the roof. I am standing knee-deep in dirt with a shovel in my hand. Mother has wrapped a kerchief round her head. Her glasses glint in the sun. When my sisters appear on the scene, gangly and softly tittering, she waves them back into the house to fetch us pails of water, and they skip out of our sight in their matching midi blouses. I summon up all my strength to set the pear tree in the ground, unwinding its burlap shroud. It is taller than I. Make room for the roots, my mother cries. Dig the hole deeper.
Now, when you think of the portrait written in 1969, and you think of this poem written in 1989, the idea is he's finally giving credit to his mother. He's finally acknowledging her sacrifice in a poem with love, with difficulty. Her glasses glinting in the sun. I mean, those hard images that he folds into that poem. He's made full circle with my mother's pears. And from the portrait, he has come to some of that realization that you have. He finally got it, I think. He got it. And his letters, which are in the book, really go into that, how he changed, how he came to know her, how he came to admire her, because of the conflicts. Two very strong-willed people. That's what he said. She had a strong will, so did I, and we know how that can clash. Mother and son, the only boy in a family of two girls and a mother. You know, there were clashes, but he realized it. I think My Mother's Pears is the greatest self-realization poem ever written, just because of knowing the other poems. So, kudos to you. It's dedicated to Greg and Carol.